Hello there. Welcome to my tutorial on the dev tool, inspectors, and components inside of Neos. These are three of the most common things that you'll come across when you're building inside of Neos. They're usually tied together, and we're going to start off with taking them in order with the dev tool. Now, how do you get a dev tool? Like most of the common building tools that you'll use, it'll be found in your inventory. Your inventory will normally be found by opening your dashboard and then clicking inventory on the bottom, and that'll bring you to generally this. If you're not looking at a screen that has both the Essential Tools folder and the Neos Essentials folder, then you'll click this white bar at the top where it says inventory to go back to your base root. However, we are already there, so we're going to double click on Essential Tools. Double click on something in the inventory screen, you'll use your trigger and you'll pull it in. Pulling it in all the way, clicks once, pulling it in twice, double clicks. Here, we can see all of the tools that are generally used for building. We are mostly concerned, however, with this one. This right here is the dev tool. We're going to select it with the laser and then double click to bring it out in the world. Now, as you can see, when I grab the tool, it automatically aligns to my hand. This is how you start to use the tool. You can point at it, open the context menu, do things. However, we want to equip the tool. Equipping a tool, while not necessary to make it work, helps in keeping it on your hand. Such as if I wanted to do something with the tool and then wanted to grab something else, the tool would end up staying over here and I might lose it. Equipping helps it stay in your hand. And there's three ways to do this. First is to grab it. Grab an item in Neos, you just point your hand at it, and pull your grip, and it'll be in your hand. We can then go ahead and click in the context menu, which will be, for most controllers, it'll be the top of the two buttons that you have. We'll click the equip button. This now holds it in the hand so I can use it freely without worrying about dropping it and stuff. There are two other ways to equip it. One is to point your laser at it, and if you can't see the laser visible on your finger, then all you need to do is simply pull your trigger in, and you can see it appear in the world. You can then point it at the tool, click with your trigger, and then click Equip Tool. This is good for equipping tools at a distance. And the third way is to grab the tool with your hand, with your laser, simply done by pointing your laser again at the tool, and this time, instead of pulling trigger, pulling just your grip. While pulling the grip, you'll hold it, and then you can pull the joystick on that same hand backwards, and it'll equip it into your hand. So now, we have a dev tool equipped, but what can we do with it? The main use of the dev tool on its own is to select and move things. So let's say that I want to select my hand. I simply point the laser. You can see the laser mostly will usually stay visible. You can point it at your hand, and then you can press secondary. Secondary is, on most controllers, clicking the thumbstick in. However, on index, it'll be clicking in the touchpad or the little thing in the middle. So you can just click secondary, and you select. This is a gizmo. Gizmos are made up of three parts. One, this purple bounding box with yellow corners. This denotes the size of the item. On its own, there's not much that you can interact with about it. However, it can show you how large an object is. I can show you more about that in a second. The second part is the main gizmo. This is used to move it around, and moving around is generally the most common use of the tool. And then third are the transforms changes up here, the transform buttons. Clicking them will change the transform. So let's go in order, starting with this first part, this top part, the transform buttons. Starting over here, what this button will do is this goes up in the hierarchy, where if I click this twice, you have to double click it, it selects the parent object. Now, you may notice how doing this has also increased bounding box. This is because what I've done is I've moved from the collider of my hand up to the hand itself, and contained under the hand is the laser. The laser does not stop at the edge of the hand, but because it's contained underneath the hand, you can see the bounding box goes out with it as well, If I point the laser down, you can see the bounding box moves down with it. The bounding box will often try to stay as square as possible, so you can get some interesting results. And if you ever select your own gizmo, it'll usually get smaller like this. The second options is this one. This little box right here. We click that. It turns the gizmo to global. You can see with it being a gray box, it follows the orientation of my hand. Blue is forward, green is up, and red is left right. If we change it to global, it is now set to the global up, forward, and left and right. Or right and left. If we change to one of these other options, we can go to this one. This turns it into a rotation gizmo. And this turns it into a scale gizmo. However, what do these mean? So, let's give you a brief example. We can go ahead and take my hand and move it. Actually, we can't because that is not going to work. What we can do, however, is we can move this. So, we're going to select the sword, and I can now take this and move it. The gizmo allows me to move it in three-dimensional space around the map as I need. This is good if your item doesn't have any grabbers, or you just have to get something like really precisely right where you want it. This movement style can also be changed because you notice it follows where I'm pointing my laser. The movement can also be changed by going into the context menu here and selecting interaction projection. If we change it to interaction tip, moving the gizmo will directly follow where the tip moves, rather than where it's pointing to. This is great for precision work or moving things just the tiniest amount, whereas projection is great if you want to shoot something off into space. We're going to keep it on tip for most of this, just to make things a little bit easier. The next gizmo type is this one. This is for rotation. Rotation, we can simply point a laser at any of the lines here, click and rotate. And you can see that the item underneath will rotate with it. Rotate this around. And then we have the scale gizmo. The scale gizmo allows you to adjust the size by simply pulling on any of these. Let's do this one right here. You can see that the object grows and changes in size. And you may notice this gray box in the middle. What this is useful for, and all of the gizmos actually have a centerpiece like that, although it's not as visible on all of them. Actually, the rotation doesn't, but the transform and scale do, is you can actually do this with you can click on that, and that'll scale or move everything together. So I can scale the whole thing at once, or I can move the whole thing as one in all 3D axes. Now, let's undo all that. And to undo any movements you've made, as well as undo most things that you can edit or change inside of Neos, we're just going to open our context menu and just click undo a bunch of times. And with that, I can change it back to the original that I had it as. Now, let's say that we want to get rid of all the selections here. We can simply open our context menu and click deselect all. And with that, deselects. Now let's say you want to delete something in the world. Very simply, to do that, you would just go into here, and in here you'd have destroy selected. This will destroy the last item that you selected, because you can select multiple items, but only last one will ever get deleted. If you click on this, you'll notice that a prompt, I face the camera, you'll notice that a prompt comes up to really destroy selected, because this will permanently remove it. However, If you do permanently remove an item, you can simply bring it back. Now, as for multiple selections, you can go into the context menu here and click on Selection. This will change from single to multi. This just means that I can select this, I can select that, I can select that, and I can even aim at the gizmo and select itself a whole bunch of times. And then I simply remove them all with the deselect all option. So that's the basics of using a gizmo. You can also, on the transform, grab these little squares that are here, and move on 2 axes like that as well. That's the basics of using the gizmos and the main dev toolkit. However, there's more that you can do with the dev tool. You can also create primitives, as well as other base objects, by simply opening the context menu and clicking Create New. From here, you can create a light in the world. You can create a nice big sphere. You can even create an empty object. And doing that brings us into inspectors. So inspectors show you slots. Slots are what make up the objects in the world. This right here, as you can see the name listed on top, or let's move that over a bit. And let's rotate it to the screen. You can see it is named empty object, as is shown here in the inspector. This allows me to edit or work with this object. If you ever want to open an inspector on your own object as well, you can simply point out with the laser to select it as before, and then you open your context menu to click Open Inspector, and it will then open an inspector for what you have selected. So, let's go through what these buttons here do. So, because there's a lot of stuff going on here, and it's a bit confusing at first. Over here, it shows the hierarchy. This will show what all these slots are, starting with what you selected, which is our empty object, and anything below it. Currently, we don't have anything beneath it, as it's just been created. We have this button right here, which will go up to the root of the object. Root is often defined by a component that exists on an object called the object root, or whatever Neos thinks reasonably is the object root. This will go up by 1 level. And I'll demonstrate all these in a second as well as I go through them. This will destroy the item that you have selected, everything that's underneath it, as well as all assets on it. The pink trash can will end up deleting the slot, all of its children, but saving the assets. And I'll demonstrate more about that in a second as well. This button will create a child, or create a parent of the object. A parent means a slot that is above another slot, and a child means a slot that is below another slot. This button, the star, creates a child. This button will duplicate it, and this button will go down to the currently selected slot. So, let's demonstrate a few of these. Let's start off by adding a child to this. We're going to do that by clicking the star. You can now see that we have a child object of this empty object, as well as we've gained a little arrow right there next to empty object. Clicking this arrow will simply collapse the item. And if we click it again, it'll open it. Sometimes an item will be underneath another one, or a slot will be underneath another slot. However, you won't see it at first, and you'll have to click on the circle to see if there's anything contained underneath it, simply because the inspector won't have updated yet. So let's say we have this item, and we want to create a parent for it. We can simply press this up arrow, and we now have a parent of the child we just created. We can then double click on this slot and go up by 1 to see the previous parent that we had, and expand it to see the parent and to see everything that we've created. We could then press the green to duplicate it, and now we have 2. We can click on this one, or let's go with this one to remove it, and this one to also remove it. And if we want to go all the way down to the bottom here, we can click this arrow right here to go all the way down to the bottom. That's the basics of how those work. We can also use this to go up by 1, and this is the spawn area of the world. This is the spawn area of my world as I've made it. You can see the empty object is stored right here. We can click there, go back down, or we can go all the way up to the root, and then go all the way up to its root, and its root. And then once you get to the root, there's nothing there. This is what the default inspector, if you haven't selected anything, will open. It will open the root of the world. That's most of what goes on the left side here. What about on the right side? This will allow us to change elements of whatever slot we've had or had components about it. So let's say we want to change its name. Currently it's just named empty object. But I can click on this with my laser, and then in my local space, other users will not be able to see this, a keyboard will pop up. This will allow me to type into it anything that I want. So I can go ahead and type in the basement object, and I've now changed it to the basement object. Also of note, my keyboard is customized, so yours will look different than what mine is, but it'll work just the same. So, we've named it the basement object. We're also able to see what its parent is. If I wanted to see its parent, we could then go to click on one of these 2 arrows. These 2 arrows right here will appear on a lot of fields that reference a slot. Clicking one of them, the left one, that curves up like this, is the same thing as opening an inspector for that slot. You can see that I've opened another inspector right there. The other one, in this case, since it is a slot, will open another inspector of the slot, but if we're looking at a component, which I'll show you in a second, it'll open a component window. We can take this slot and make it active or inactive. Active or inactive means that all things underneath it will stop running or stop rendering. I'll show you more about that in a second. And persistent, we can click that, and you can see that the slot has turned orange. Persistence simply means that when this item is saved, whether or not this slot will save with it. If, for example, I had the puppy ears set to non-persistent on my avatar, and I saved my avatar, when I then reload my avatar next time, the set puppy ears would not be there because they were non-persistent. We can also from here edit our position, rotation, and scale. The same thing that our gizmos do, but this allows us to edit the numbers directly. Such as if I want this to go up from 1.64 to 1.65, you can see as I edit the numbers, the item moves. You can do this for the rotation and the scale as well. However, let's say you want, for example, the item to be centered back to 0. Well, let's say you've rotated a lot and you don't want that rotation. These 3 buttons here will allow you to redo or undo the rotation. So, if I click rotation, you can see we have 0, negative 152, 0, resets it to 0. Down scale, resets it to 1, and clicking on the position resets it to 0. Now it's gone to the center of the world. Create pivot at center is effectively the same as clicking this arrow. However, this is used to create a parent at the center of the bounding box of your item. This is useful if you have stuff that's off-center, but you need to have it centered onto a parent in some form. Jump to means that you will move to the item, and bring to means that it'll come to you. Parent under local user space means that it'll parent it under where your own avatar is, under the slot that you're under. And parented on the world root will put it under the root of the world. And you can see that in the parent, when I click local user space, it goes into spawn area, that's where I am. And if I click world root, it goes into the world root. There's also 3 buttons up here that are very helpful. We have, first off, the Scene Inspector Help button. I've moved off of my trackers, I just realized. The Scene Inspector Help button will present a bunch of help for how the Scene Inspector works, mostly covering the stuff that I've covered here. It describes what the right pane contains, what the left pane contains, and basics of the inspector itself. This button will pin the inspector to you. So currently I'm walking around in my room freely. However, if I was to move using my joystick, the inspector goes with me. This is very good if you're running around a world, editing a bunch of things. You can just click that button and keep the inspector with you at all times, so you don't have to worry about dragging it around or keeping up a bunch of windows for all the things that you have. You can just let them follow you around. And then, rather self-explanatory, the red X will close the inspector. We're going to keep it open though, because we're still going to work on this. But, let's say we accidentally closed it. The slot's gone. And this is where the secret other way to select an item comes in. Because if you know where the center of your item is, you can simply select in the air and find it. This is really good if you have an item with no collider, because this laser requires on a collider to hit it. If you have an item that you can't collide with, you can simply take the tip of the tool, put it where the center of the item is, and click select. You might often experience this when you're trying to select something in a world with somebody next to you and you accidentally select something that's on them. It's because you can select the center of an object just by doing that. Very useful for if you lose a collider or you lose the inspector for something that you're working on. So, that's the basics of the inspector and the dev tool. Now let's cover components. Components define what an object is and does. Let's make this, through the use of components, into a box. Let's go into the child of it. To do components, you simply click down here to attach component. And that'll spawn out one of these. This is the component attacher screen. Each one of these is a menu, or is a submenu that contains components underneath it. If we click into assets, we have more submenus, and then components that we can attach. These are all for assets, such as audio files, texture files, storing a mesh or such. All of that is here. Most of these will be automatically created, and most of the components that you can find in this thing, the majority of them, are things that are automatically created by Neos, and you'll rarely ever come across the need to make them yourself. Most of the ones that you're going to be using at any point in time will be contained in Transform. Transform and drivers contains most of the components to move things around. So, and to scroll through this menu, any of the menus, you simply point at it, hold your laser with primary, and just drag up and down. So, let's go ahead and add a box. We can do that starting off with assets. We're going to go into assets, and we're going to go into procedural meshes. This will allow me to choose of any of the procedural built-in meshes that Neos has put onto this slot. So let's say we want to create a box. We would go find the box mesh right here. We click on it twice, and now you can see it's been added. You can see a bunch of buttons that come with it, and there are 4 buttons that every single component will have. Almost everyone, at least. First is persistent. Just like with a slot, this means that the component will not save when you save the item. We have update order. You will rarely ever need to mess with that. However, this adjusts how Neos will send this component through the update cycle in order to render it, such as if you have one modifier that you need to run on the Neos engine before another modifier, you might use the update order. You rarely ever touch it, though. I've only seen one use of it. Enabled will, like this, will, like the active, turn it on or off. However, it doesn't always do an on or off for something, such as with the box mesh. There's nothing to enable or disable. There's no scripting, there's no running. It's simply a box. And then high priority integration. I will be honest that I do not know what that one does. It is on most of the components, and for the most part, just leave it alone. If you don't know what it does, don't worry about it. And then with the component comes a bunch of its own settings. I'm not going to worry too much about these, but I'll show you how to modify them in a second, but I'm not going to go into too much explaining with them. And then there's 2 more things here. There's 2 buttons. These will run some kind of event. Let's say we want to set up the box. We want to add the renderer. We could simply, because some components have easy access setup like this, we could simply set up renderer. So I can click this, and now there's a big box. We're going to move that very temporarily out of the way so that we can continue with doing more features to this, because as you can see currently, this is just a big box. It's in the way. I can't do too much to it. One thing I can do, however, I can make it smaller. And that's where editing these fields comes in. With the box mesh specifically, we can adjust the size of it. So I could click on the Z value here, and I could say instead of 1, I want it to be, let's bring the box into view here for this. Instead of 1, I want it to be 0.2. Now you can't see from the camera that well, but you can see through the bounding box, it's changed the dimensions this way. Let's change the other one to also match 0.2. And there we go. We have a box that fits on the screen. And then if we want to adjust the height as well, I could click on it and type in 0.2. But there's another feature, which is dragging fields. You can see that I have here fields that I can edit. I can simply, instead of typing into this one, because I want to clone this value over here, I can simply grab this with my laser, and I have the value 0.2 on my laser. I can then drop it. I can point the laser right up there, and to grab it, again, you just grip with your controller. I can just drop it, and it changes the value as well. So you can drag and drop values in that way. Now we have a nice sized box. What if we want to edit some more of the features? Let's say we want to change its color. We could click over here on albedo color, and you can see over here a white box, and here's a black box. This box will denote what the color is, and this is your RGBA value. R means red, G, green, B, blue, A is alpha, more or less invisibility. How transparent is it? If we want to adjust the colors manually, we could set the green to 0, and you can see as I adjust it, the colors change. Or I can click on this red field itself and get a color picker. When you click on a color field, you'll be able to adjust the colors directly through this little interface. You can adjust the sliders for the red, the green, the blue, and the alpha. That won't show up here as this does not render transparent at the moment. And you also have emissiveness in a color picker. That's the brightness of the object. It'll effectively overdrive the values, and you can manually type in emissiveness by simply setting it to values that are over 1. Clicking cancel will then revert it back to whatever it was before. But let's say I want to make this into something I can grab. Very simply, you attach components, and then grabbables would be found inside of transform interaction, and you don't need to worry about remembering where all the components are. Generally, you can ask, and if you ask somebody for a component searcher, there's a lot of people that'll give you one that you can simply type in what component you want, and it'll tell you where to find it inside of this massive dictionary. So let's add a grabbable. And in order to grab it, because I still can't move this, we'd need a collider. So we'd go into physics, colliders, box collider, and now I can grab this. And this sort of shows the way that you can use components, you can put them together in order to create an object in the world. It's useful to know how to edit them, and it's useful to know how to build your own stuff with them. We can also show off another fun feature of the inspector here, which is this collider, as you can see, based on the laser and it being blocked off, is rather big. Sometimes it'll mean that you can't interact with the inspector because there'll be a collider in the way. Sometimes, in this case, it does, and I'm not sure exactly what instances it does it, but sometimes the laser gets blocked and you need it to be unblocked. If you're ever unable to interact with your inspector, you can simply take the laser and put the tip right up on the inspector like this. At a small distance away, you're able to then click on items, such as clicking the enable turns off the box collider, right up close, rather than having to worry about trying to hit it with your laser from a distance. However, let's take this and make it smaller just by setting from local bounds. That matches it to there, and we have ourselves a perfect little box that we can now edit, move around, and just have a good time with. There we go. Our own box created from scratch. If you have no inspect slot, of course, it'll just show null on the other side. Now, let me show you two more features of components. One of them is driving. So let's say that we want to have a value copy another value. Let's go ahead and re-render another box. Procedural meshes, box mesh, setup renderer, change the size to something smaller, 0.2. There we go. And then we add a grabbable and a box collider. So let's show how driving fields works. So, for example, this collider can be set separately from the box. I've now made the collider 1 unit tall, even though the box itself is only 0.2. Let's say I want that value to match whatever size I have set for the box in here in size. Let's grab a component called value copy. If we go into transform drivers and value copy, we can double click on that, and we can now see a list of values here. It's value copy in different value types. In our case, we are going to be doing a float 3. Each of these is a float, a decimal value, and there's 3 of them. So we go to value copy, double click on float 3, and now we have the component down there, value copy. We're going to take our value of the size right here, and to do this, we simply point our laser at size until it's blue, and we can grab, and we have the component name right there, along with the reference ID. Reference IDs are the internal way that Neos will refer slots, components, and parts of slots in order to have a consistent system for just keeping everything in track. we can take this now and we can drop it into source. And now you can see right there that the source has changed to be the size of the box mesh component on this object name. This will now be reading that value. And now we can take the size of box collider here, and I'm going to drop it, again, just by pointing and gripping with your controller, drop it into the target. You can see that the size has changed and the values have gone purple. We're going to pop out another inspector here, and to pop out an inspector for another slot, you can simply grab the slot name and click in the air. Or if you want to pop out an inspector for the component alone, which is what the other arrow does, the second arrow right here on this field, we can simply click just the little straight up arrow, and this will pop out a component inspector. So we can put that right there, and you can see when I scroll up to the size, any of these values, as I change them, will also change the size of the collider. So if I select this again, sometimes you'll have a object not be selectable. This will happen if you have removed its gizmo somehow, but you've not done deselect all. So there we go. And reselect. And now, as let's see, is that in view? There we go. You can see the purple values there. As I change this on the size of the box mesh, it also changes the size of the collider. That's the benefit of driving values in this way. And you can see that when I try to change this manually from the other end, if I try to change this manually to 0.2, you see that the value changes, but when I press enter, it changes back. Driven values cannot be edited. If you have driven values somewhere on your avatar, you'll generally have to go searching through, find them. But it is a very powerful tool in order to make things match up, such as I have a couple things in this world that spin all in the same rate, but I don't have them on the same slot. So I can just use value copy to match their spins together. So we can now close that. You can also pop out a component inspector by simply grabbing a component by the name. This is a material. Some components will pop out what they are, such as this will pop out a wireframe of the box mesh, and you simply press secondary in the air, you click in the air with your trigger, and it'll pop out a component inspector, as well as for some things, mainly assets, it'll pop out a visual of the asset. Now let's say we don't want the box mesh component here. We could simply click X on this, and it'll delete the mesh. And if we bring it back, it won't come back. This is because the reference for it has been destroyed. So we'd have to grab the component again, simply pointing and clicking, and we'd go to our mesh renderer here, which was auto-created when I clicked Setup Renderer. We simply drop this in the mesh, and you can either do this by letting go of the grip, or you can click with the laser. Then we can open a component inspector, or we can open a slot inspector. There's two other buttons here that you can find, or there's actually three that we can go over. First will be this button. This little circle with a line through it will null out the field. So we have a material on this right now of just white, which is just the default material. Let's change it to red, just to give it a little interest. If we click on this now, what it does is it removes the material. It's nulled out, and we can simply drag the material back in. If we wanted to remove the material slot completely, however, we could click on the X, and that would remove it from the list. Nullifications, such as when you click on the circle here, can be undone with your context menu. Deleting something in a list, however, cannot. So whenever you are going through materials and stuff or lists like this, always ensure that you drop it off, that you make sure you're not clicking that X, or you will lose all of the progress you may have made, and you might have to find the material somewhere else, figure out where it came from, because you can have slots coexisting all over the world. I could have a material stored on one slot in some other part of the world hierarchy, and then whatever goes to somewhere else, and then finding where it came from, it can be a massive mess. Some fields will have these arrows on them, and these will just select different settings of the thing. In this case, not much happens. There's also another kind of drive field that I can show you on an avatar. So you saw the purple drive field, or the pink drive field, which shows that a value is being driven, cannot be edited. You also may find, we go into my head proxy, you may find these blue fields. Blue fields are what I've heard referred to as courtesy drives. These you can see, for example, referencing position on head proxy, it is referencing this field right here, which is being driven. However, if I were to null this out, that field still gets driven. Courtesy drives, you can change them out, but often they will have some base item, such as in this case, the, I think just the fact that it exists on this slot, they will simply continue to drive and will not really respect any changes you try to do in that form. So most times you see a blue one, don't worry about trying to change it. It'll just sort of continue doing its own business. We'll also have sliders present in components. Simply point your trigger at it, and point your control at it, and pull your trigger to move it back and forth. This is the avatar audio, so I could go ahead and, if I was in a world with other people, I could adjust my normal volume voice. So when I'm just speaking normally, I could adjust the volume voice, I could adjust the distance, roll off, a whole bunch of fancy stuff. This checkbox is a Boolean, which you see me clicking before. Boolean simply means on or off. And then we also have the active. I showed you before how an active clicks, but I hadn't shown you what it does when you turn it off. So let's say that I want to turn off my entire avatar. Quite simply, I would go here and click on active.